I died in the first year of marrying Jason. During the fire, I sent him a message, "Jason, there's a fire at home." He coldly replied, "Put it out first, I'm in a meeting." I looked at a photo a woman had just sent me and gave a bitter smile. Feeling hopeless, I died in the fire. But heaven gave me a second chance, rewinding time back to 10 years ago. When the new transfer student Jason was assigned to sit next to me, I raised my hand, "Teacher, I want to sit with a girl." As the homeroom teacher was placing Jason next to me, I raised my hand. This action sparked some whispers among the classmates. The homeroom teacher tapped the podium, quieting the class before asking me, "Why?" "Because in the first year of our marriage, Jason let me die in a fire to be with another woman." Yes, I was reborn. Reborn on the day I met Jason. 10 years ago, when Jason became my desk mate, I was just like all the other girls in class. My heart pounded. From then on, I started a long journey to chase after him, wanting to give him stars from the sky only to meet a tragic end. In this life, I must stay far away from him. Because I want to focus on my studies, and he looks so good that I might get distracted, I said with a serious tone. The teacher probably didn't expect me to be so blunt and was taken aback. But in the end, he did change my desk mate. "That tactic you used was pretty smart," said my new desk mate Nick, tossing his backpack onto the table next to me and raising an eyebrow. I tried hard to remember some information about him. I vaguely recalled he was an athlete and rarely came to class. "What tactic?" Nick sat down next to me, cocked his head towards Jason, who was surrounded by girls, and said, "You like that guy?" I was stunned and followed his gaze. Jason sat at his spot, his back straight in a white shirt. He still looked like the boy I used to like. "I don't like him." I quickly looked away and started organizing my books. Nick suddenly leaned closer and stared at me just as I frowned. He said, "You're lying. Eyes don't lie when you like someone." Nick was right. I still liked Jason. From the first moment I saw him standing on the platform. But that was just 10 years of habit, a little leftover affection. I loved myself more now. Nick was indeed an athlete. He barely attended 2 classes a day. I was mostly alone. This actually let me concentrate on my studies, and I gradually lost my feelings and focus on Jason. By the end of the semester, my grade surprisingly climbed to second place, right after Jason. For a while, I became the person people said would be the best match for Jason. "What are you afraid of? She doesn't even like Jason. Their classmates say they can't stand each other." During the break, I overheard this in the bathroom. There was soft sobbing from the next stall. The person continued, "Don't worry, you're so pretty. Jason will like you eventually. So sweet and considerate. Besides, I heard Jenny likes Nick." The crying stopped abruptly, and a girl's voice asked softly, "Really? Really, you wouldn't believe it, right? Even someone like Nick has admirers." I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood up, fastened my pants, and kicked open the next stall's door, startling the 2 girls inside. "I indeed don't like Jason," I said, daring them to reply, "but I also don't like Nick." Both girls were so scared they didn't dare to speak. I turned to leave but paused. "Also, Nick isn't someone like that. He's 1,000 times better than Jason." After saying this, I left the bathroom without looking back. Returning to the classroom, I saw Nick was already in his seat, spinning a pen in his hand and raising an eyebrow at me. "Who ticked you off?" I shook my head. At least someone like him wouldn't stand by and let me die in a fire. Jason and I, due to our excellent grades and looks, were chosen to represent the school in a city speech competition. Throughout the trip, I tried to avoid being alone with him. Until backstage at the speech event, he stood behind me and asked lowly, "I've never understood, why do you hate me so much?" I didn't expect him to talk to me, Jenny. When I didn't respond, he called my name. It was the first time since my rebirth that I heard him call my name. And it sounded wonderful. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and turned to him. "I hate people who are good-looking and smart." He was taken aback, then suddenly laughed. "That doesn't make sense," he said with a smile. you're the same kind of person. No one hates themselves. In the past life, he never looked at me and smiled like this, not even at our wedding. And he was wrong. Some people do hate themselves. Next, let's welcome Jenny for her speech. Before I could say more, the host announced my name. I straightened my back, took the microphone, and walked onto the stage. It was a relief. I quite liked who I had become now. I used to chase after Jason, never standing on such a big stage. Living a new life, I realized there were many things more worth pursuing than Jason, and just as I stepped out of the venue, Nick stood in front of me. He glanced at Jason behind me, then looked meaningfully at me. "What are you doing here?" Fearing he might say something out of line, I quickly walked over and pulled him away with me. He followed me, looking back at Jason with a mischievous grin. "Feeling guilty?" I rolled my eyes at him. "Guilty, my foot. You came just in time. I didn't want to go back with Jason." Nick was on the swim team. I sat in the large sports hall for the first time, watching him compete. He stood on the starting block in his swim trunks, looking towards me. I seemed to see his cocky expression. As the gun fired, he dived into the water. At that moment, I realized he looked even better than Jason. More importantly, he had the abs and pecs Jason didn't have. He was only 17. Yet so well built. Lost in my thoughts, when I came to, Nick had already finished first. He waved at me with his signature smirk. Indeed, 1,000 times better than Jason. After the speech, ditching Jason to watch Nick's competition and returning to school with him became the talk of the school. Jason's fangirls are getting less hostile towards me. But I forgot, Nick isn't easy to deal with either. "Are you Jenny?" Someone blocked my way home from school. A group of people stood in front of me, clearly troublemakers by the way they dressed. I lied with a straight face, "I'm not." The leader of the group asked the girl next to her, "Did we get the wrong person?" As they were still discussing, Jason called out to me from not far away, "Jenny. In my past life, you didn't get me killed enough, and now this life too." The leader scoffed, "Dare to lie to me?" She took 2 steps towards me. I took 2 steps back. Jason realized something was off and started walking towards me. "What are you doing?" he reprimanded lightly. This would only annoy them more. The leader glanced back at him, raising an eyebrow. "A knight in shining armor?" Soon enough, Jason and I were both cornered. "What do you want?" Just when I thought we were about to get beaten up, a voice full of swagger came from above. I looked up just in time to see Nick jump down from the wall. "Nick." The leader seemed embarrassed. Nick gave her a look. "You know I don't hit girls. That's why many girls at school don't like Nick. He's a thug who gets into fights, which is not a great look at a prestigious high school. If you mess with my deskmate again," Nick slung his backpack over his shoulder as he walked toward me, "I won't hold back." The group dispersed quickly without saying another word. "Now that's a knight in shining armor. I just saved you, shouldn't you thank me?" Nick, with his backpack slung over one shoulder, walked slowly behind me, his tone somewhat unfriendly. His hostility wasn't aimed at me. I turned around to see both him and Jason had stopped. Jason frowned slightly, showing his annoyance. I knew him. He never liked guys like Nick. But it's none of my business now. "Nick, thanks today." I picked up Nick's conversation to Jason. "I need to get home early, so I'm going ahead." The two, who had been at odds, both turned to look at me when they heard this. "I'll walk you home," they almost said in unison. "Jenny, this is your award certificate from the speech contest." Jason handed me the certificate after glancing at Nick, visibly concerned. "I'll walk you home to make sure no one else bothers you." I took the certificate, but before I could say no, Nick scoffed. He quickly walked over and put his arm around my shoulder. "Jason, worry about protecting yourself." With a cocky grin, he looked at me. "Come on, I'll protect you." His antics made me chuckle despite my irritation. I elbowed him in the stomach, shrugged off his arm, and walked towards home, waving as I went. "No need, I'm not a damsel in distress." I've got my own ways. Nick's booming laughter echoed behind me. Maybe it was contagious because I found myself smiling too. The frustration and annoyance brought by Jason's approach melted away. Nick wasn't so bad after all. I think I was misled by Jason before. One day, I woke up to find my house suddenly on fire. Terrified, I jumped out of bed only to find the door blocked by flames. I could only grab a wet towel and hide on the balcony. To my surprise, right after I called the fire department, I received a photo. It was of Jason with a disheveled woman. As I stared at the photo, my blood felt like it froze, and my fear was doused like a bucket of ice water. "Jason, the house is on fire," I texted him, knowing he wasn't supposed to be at work today. He'd always told me not to call during work, so I'd never called him, even in emergencies. A while later, he replied, "You handle the fire first, I'm in a meeting." Meeting? I looked at the photo again and laughed bitterly. As the blaze engulfed me, I vaguely heard the sound of fire trucks approaching. Suddenly, someone opened the door from the outside. A strong light shone in. "Jenny, get up or you'll be late." I opened my eyes to see my mom standing by my bed, exasperated. Still shaken from the dream, I sat up and hugged her tightly. "Mom, I had a nightmare. It was so scary." Mom patted my back gently. "That's what happens when you oversleep." "Who told you to sleep in?" "Mom, I'm not a kid anymore. You can't fool me." I burst out laughing. Thank goodness it was just a dream. Feeling much better thanks to my mom's antics, I got up, freshened up, ate, and headed to school. Unexpectedly, I ran into Nick right after leaving the complex. "Nick?" He blew a bubble with his gum and waved. "What a coincidence. You live here?" I nodded and kept walking. "Do you live here too?" He shook his head, leisurely following me. "I live up ahead, just passing through." Jason was acting strange. "Jenny, do you know how to solve this?" He suddenly appeared next to my desk, one break startling me. Last night's dream was still vivid in my mind, and I didn't want to see him at all. I kept working without pausing. "I don't know." "How do you know without looking?" He never used to act like this. I reluctantly glanced at the problem in his hand. It was the one I had just finished. "I don't know." I calmly turned the page of my workbook. After Jason left, I turned to see Nick lying on his desk, eyes wide open and laughing. Sunlight fell through the window, illuminating his eyes and eyebrows filled with mirth. He was not only a different personality from Jason but a different kind of good-looking. Vibrant and full of life. "What are you laughing at?" I asked. He blinked. "I just think your tactic of playing hard to get is working perfectly. He's already obediently running to you, and it hasn't even been a year." I picked up my workbook and smacked him on the head. "If you keep talking nonsense, I'll tear your mouth apart." I raised my fist menacingly. He just laughed even harder. His laughter was loud, making the whole class look our way. Panicking, I quickly lunged forward to cover his mouth. When he stopped laughing, I realized my mistake and let go hurriedly. He suddenly leaned in close, staring intently into my eyes. Just as I was about to punch him, he laughed and dropped back onto his desk. This time, I wasn't lying. I really didn't like him anymore. Haven't liked him for a long time. The 10 years of feelings vanished at the moment of my rebirth, leaving only a habitual heartbeat. That tiny bit of heartbeat disappeared after so many recurring nightmares. Now, I just want to stay far away from him, as far as possible. Best if we never meet again after the college entrance exams. "You want to go to S-City?" Nick, walking beside me, seemed surprised by my answer. "Why?" "Because I like it. In my previous life, I didn't fill out any applications for S-City because I followed Jason to B-City because I heard it's a place of freedom." I looked down at my shadow under the streetlight. Nick is tall, but the streetlight shrunk his shadow into a small lump. It was kind of funny. S-City is nice. He kicked a stone by his foot. His voice seemed to carry a bit of happiness I couldn't quite catch. At the entrance to my neighborhood, I said goodbye and asked him, do you really live ahead? He blinked in surprise and then nonchalantly said, yeah, wanna check it out? No, thanks. I grabbed my backpack and rushed inside. Later, I thought about it carefully. The reason I never ran into him before was probably that I was always focused on chasing after Jason, ignoring everyone else. Especially the one Jason liked the least, Nick. The time spent going to and from school with Nick didn't last long before the term ended. During the new semester of senior year, it was time to change seats again. Jason, switch seats with Nick, the teacher casually said from the podium. I was working on practice problems and froze. Nick immediately raised his hand. I'm not switching. He's always been nonchalant and often absent, so teachers didn't really like him. The teacher frowned, displeased. Why not? I like the sun. Nick said, opening the window. The sunlight outside was perfect, making him look especially striking. On the other side, Jason was looking at me, as if determined to get Nick's seat. I raised my hand too. Teacher, the class president has good grades, and many students ask him questions during breaks. I'm worried it'll affect others and our studies if we sit together. Implying that it's best if Jason continues to sit alone. The teacher thought it over and agreed with my reasoning. But in the end, the teacher switched Nick with the girl behind him. Nick was pleased with the result, and he playfully bumped his desk towards mine. As long as you don't sit with Jason, it doesn't matter who you sit with. Senior year studies are intense. Even with it being my second time, occasionally I felt suffocated. Nick's training became more frequent, so he was in class less often. But discussions about him grew. Girls who used to look down on Nick began to switch sides as he won more and more competitions. Aside from poor grades and a bad temper, he really didn't have any other flaws. That was the conclusion from my new desk mate, Cindy, when gossiping about him. My hand didn't stop working on problems, but I added, he's actually got a pretty good temper. Cindy didn't expect me to respond to the gossip and leaned closer in surprise. I also heard that you like him, is it true? That rumor was old. I paused, looked at her a bit helplessly. It's not true, how could I like him? Don't listen to their nonsense. As soon as I said that, a water bottle was placed on the edge of my desk. I turned and saw Nick, beads of sweat on his forehead. A bit awkward. After a few seconds of eye contact, I looked down at the bottle. How much for the water? I'll pay you back. Nick seemed upset. He didn't take my money, nor did he say anything to me. After he slept through a class, Jason showed up. Jason put a form on my desk, softly saying, the teacher wants you to participate in this competition. It will help secure a spot for you. Hearing the words secure a spot made it impossible not to get excited. I took the form without asking any questions, not expecting that the competition would be with Jason. So, if you knew I was coming, you wouldn't have come? At the training class, Jason asked as he sat next to me. I glanced up at him. Now I could look at him calmly. Of course not. I moved away politely. Securing a spot is important. More important than you. Maybe it was my obvious move or my cold words. Jason's smile faltered for a moment. I ignored him and started preparing my work. When I finished the problems and looked up after class, I saw Nick standing outside the classroom. He was no longer the same. Lots of girls approached him to chat. You like someone like that? Jason followed my gaze to Nick outside. His tone indifferent. I turned back to him, firmly replying, I just don't like people like you. What are you doing here? I asked Nick, who was walking beside me now. Again, passing by? He patted my head. Didn't you know the gym is next door? Instinctively, I looked back, seeing the gym. Do you always train at this time? I came to the training class after school, so it was quite late already. How else do you think championships are won? He winked mischievously. Saying this in such a carefree manner oddly made it seem as if winning came easy to him. I smiled and nodded. All right, do I have the honor to treat the champion to a burger? To atone for my earlier offense. A burger? I nodded towards a roadside stand. Nick glanced at the food stall, eyes crinkling in amusement. All right, the champion will grant you this chance, but before the burgers arrived, a woman came. She wore an exquisite makeup, a red dress, and high heels, standing across from Nick. Nick? Her voice was soft. Nick glanced up at her, and his smile vanished. The woman seemed familiar, but I couldn't recall who she was despite racking my brains. I looked at the burger that was supposed to be Nick's and sighed. Seems like my offense was too deep to be atoned for with just a burger. Ever since Nick left with that woman that night, I hadn't seen him for several days. I ran into him again at the entrance of my neighborhood. He stood there all alone, a stark contrast to his usual energetic self. Nick? I called out to him. He looked up at me, and his eyes finally showed a bit of light. I thought you got kidnapped or something, haven't seen you in ages, I joked, trying to dispel the gloom hanging over him. It seemed to work. He smiled a little and gave me a light pat on the head. Can't you think better of me? Nick got hurt. I pointed to a small piece of gauze visible on his leg. What happened here? He also looked down at his leg, then tugged at his pant leg. It must have hurt because he winced but still said stubbornly, "It's nothing." How did you end up like this after just a few days? I pulled up his pant leg, frowning at the bandages wrapped around his leg. He grabbed my hand, chuckling softly. I looked up at him, a bit puzzled, and didn't expect him to lean his head down. His face was very close to mine. Really close. Close enough that his breath made my entire face feel hot. So concerned for me? You wouldn't be falling for me, would you? His eyebrows arched mischievously, and his mouth curved into a cocky smile. I jumped in surprise, broke free from his grip, and hurriedly stood up from my chair. What are you talking about? Jenny, he looked up at me, his eyes no longer looking like the ones waiting for me at the neighborhood gate. They seemed to hold the stars, all sparkly. I told you, eyes don't lie. Overwhelmed, I instinctively turned my back to him. Nick, if you dare talk nonsense, I'll rip your mouth apart. I snapped back angrily and ran home without looking back. Nick always talks without thinking. Always has. I should have been used to it by now, shouldn't have been so flustered today. Thinking this, I turned over in bed, deciding to stop thinking about it. Yep, I couldn't sleep. All thanks to Nick, that jerk, and his nonsensical chatter all day. I glared at Nick, who was waiting at the neighborhood entrance, with dark circles under my eyes. He seemed in a particularly good mood and waved at me. Good morning. Yeah, right. I ignored him and kept walking forward. Since his leg was injured, he couldn't go to training for a while and stayed in the classroom. The girls in the class were now divided into two groups, one gathered around Jason, the other around Nick. Just as I was about to massage my temples, I heard Nick's impatient voice. I'm going to sleep, stop making noise. His way of dealing with things was better than Jason's. I pursed my lips, feeling a bit pleased. The competition results came in quickly. Jason was still number 1, and I was number 2. The teacher was thrilled and said she wanted to treat the two of us to a meal. I was about to decline, but holding the trophy in my hand, I agreed instead. Jenny, Jason waved at me as soon as I walked into the restaurant. I sighed and slowly walked in. Teacher's not here yet? I sat down across from Jason. He thoughtfully poured me a glass of water. Maybe she got held up by something. I nodded. Then I slowly poured the water he gave me into a bowl, rinsed the bowl, and then rinsed the chopsticks. Could you help me take this away? Thanks. I politely blocked the waiter and handed over the bowl of water. I didn't want to drink the water Jason poured for me. Bad luck. Seeing my actions, he didn't get angry. He calmly did the same, rinsing his bowl and chopsticks. As expected from the top student, never putting himself in an awkward position. With the early admission, we'll be at the same school next year, Jason said, looking at me as he rinsed his bowl. I paused. In the previous life, this would have made me so happy I'd laugh in my dreams. But in the end, I could only get into a school not too far from him. Is there only one university for early admission? I asked, smiling at him. I think I'd like to take the college entrance exams and try for another university. That might have hit a nerve. His face stiffened slightly. I pretended not to notice his discomfort and looked at my watch. It's been a while. If the teacher doesn't come, I'll head out first. I grabbed my bag and walked out. I hadn't gone far when Jason grabbed me. I don't get it, he said, frustrated. What do you dislike about me? I turned to look at him under the streetlight. He didn't seem so lofty, holding on to me like I often held on to him. Jason, I shook off his hand and asked, you don't like me, do you? I knew Jason was nuts. In the past life, I followed him around, willing to pluck stars from the sky for him, and he wouldn't even look at me twice. Now that I don't care to look at him, he's suddenly into me. Ridiculous. During P.E. class, Nick, injured, sat beside me. I turned my head to look at him. He pointed to Jason running on the track. Look at him, running like he's about to collapse. Must be kidney deficiency. The water I had just drunk almost sprayed out. Why do you hate him so much? I asked, screwing the cap back on my bottle. From the beginning, Nick had a lot of hostility toward Jason. In the past life, they hardly interacted. Nick glanced at me, stood from the steps, dusted off his hands, and walked in another direction. Because he deserves to be hated, that explanation was as good as none. When P.E. class wasn't over, Cindy came to sit beside me. Did you hear? Something big happened. She started gossiping as soon as she sat down. Ever since she befriended me, I knew all the class gossip. What happened? Larry's mom went to the principal's office. I frowned. Who's Larry? The name rang a bell. You don't remember? He's the senior 2 grades above us, super rich, always picked up in luxury cars. Sounded familiar. I seem to recall someone like that from my freshman year, only caught a glimpse of him. But he's already graduated over a year ago. Why is his mom coming to school? Cindy looked around, leaned in, and whispered, I just passed by the principal's office and heard they were saying Nick is Larry's dad's illegitimate child. Larry's mom is demanding the principal expel Nick. No way. I stared at Cindy. Did you mishear? Nope, 100% sure. My mind flashed to the woman who took Nick away that day. Then I thought about how, despite Nick's talent for swimming, I hadn't heard anything about him winning any swimming competitions. What happened to Nick in the past life? The news about Nick being an illegitimate child spread quickly. When I heard classmates talking about it, I immediately looked at Cindy. She shook her head. I only told you. I glanced worriedly at where Nick was sitting. He must have heard those awful rumors too. Jenny, can you grab something for me? Just as I was about to go find Nick, the chemistry teacher called me from the doorway. The chem lab was in another building. As I walked in, the bell rang for class to start. Thinking I'd have to look for Nick after this class, I searched for the equipment the teacher requested. Suddenly, from behind me, as I turned around, a small flame appeared not far away. Ever since that big fire, I couldn't face fire at all. Even at home, I stayed far from the gas stove. Seeing the flames grow, my legs gave out, and I collapsed. Help. Somebody help. I was trembling all over, crying out for help. The fire kept growing, and I thought I was doomed to die in it again when suddenly someone rushed in. Jenny. It was Nick. Help me, I sobbed, gasping for breath. Nick ran to me, threw a soaking wet jacket over me, and pressed his hand tightly over my eyes. The raging fire was replaced by total darkness. It's okay, it's okay. Nick's voice was low and hoarse, like he was scared too. I'm here. I'll get you out. Like grabbing onto a lifeline in the dark, I clung to him. Lots of people seemed to arrive then, and it got very noisy. Nick held me tight as we walked out. I didn't know how long we walked until I heard Jason, panting, asking, Jenny, are you all right? Hearing his voice made me feel like I was still in the flames. A wave of dizziness hit me. Just before passing out, I heard Nick's cold voice, Stay away from her. They say dying by fire is the most painful. I was cornered on the balcony, watching the flames come at me, terrified. Help me, help me! Had no idea how many times I yelled that when someone suddenly rushed in from the fire. It was 17-year-old Nick. He tightly wrapped me in a soaked jacket. Don't be scared, Jenny. He held me, soothingly. I'm here. The flames seemed to slowly recede. The cold jacket made me shiver. Dar. Mark, will she be okay? I vaguely heard Nick's voice. Nothing serious, just a scare. She'll be fine once she wakes up, the doctor's voice sounded far away. You should worry about yourself. The principal is under a lot of pressure right now. After the doctor left, I opened my eyes. Nick stood by my bed, his clothes scorched, his face blotchy with soot and ash. You're awake? His frown eased when he saw me open my eyes. I nodded, glanced at the door, and asked, Is the principal expelling you? He hesitated, then looked down slightly. You heard about that? He gave a self-deprecating smile. Was that your mom that day? As I guessed, she looked familiar to me. Jenny, he suddenly looked up. I'm an illegitimate child. I was stunned, not expecting him to be so straightforward. So what? I looked at him. It's not your fault. Whether it's your mom or dad's mistake, it's not on you. Let the grown-ups deal with their mess. Just focus on growing up to be a good person. Maybe it was the bright infirmary lights, but Nick's eyes seemed to shine. He ruffled my hair. Okay. The lab fire and Nick's background quickly became the school's hot topic. What escalated it was Nick's stunning mom coming to school. She spoke with the principal, who reluctantly led her to his office and then cheerfully sent her out. After leaving the office, she didn't leave the school but stood outside our classroom for a while. I sighed looking at Nick's empty seat. I didn't expect her to call out to me on my way home. Jenny. She waved and smiled at me. I paused, then walked over. Auntie. She smiled gently. In that way, Nick really resembled her. You're all grown up now. That start caught me off guard. You were so little back then, she motioned with her hands, only about 6, now you're a young lady. She chatted a lot. I racked my brain to recall my 6-year-old self. Those memories seemed distant, but I caught a hint. Auntie? I hesitated. She smiled and patted my head, confirming. When I was 6, a mother and son moved in next door but only stayed for half a year. It was a forgotten memory until now. I realized the mother and son were Nick and his mom. Tell Nick not to worry about school. I've handled it, she said. Perhaps that was her main reason for finding me. I nodded. Why don't you tell him yourself? She paused. Didn't Nick tell you? She touched her belly. I got married and Nick hasn't spoken to me for years. An illegitimate child, a remarried and pregnant mother. How did Nick manage to stay so lively and seem to be doing well? I found Nick at the park near my house after a few days. He was crouched under a bridge, holding a half-burned cigarette. The dim streetlight made him look heartbreakingly sad. This must be his true self. He looked up at me and immediately tossed the cigarette aside. I watched it go out and walked over to him. You were smoking? He shook his head and spit out bubblegum to show me. What are you doing here? He scooted over to make room for me. I squatted next to him. Is this your special spot? He smiled. His smile was beautiful, like a shooting star in the night sky. Nick, why aren't you coming to school? He picked up a stone and threw it into the river. Not much point, there's only a few days left. Your mom came to school today. His hand froze mid-throw. She talked to the principal. You won't be expelled. The next stone made a big splash. Nick stood up. I don't need her pretending to care. She's married, has a baby on the way. He looked down at me, his eyes dull. She's shed her shameful past. The new baby will be legitimate, loved and welcomed by everyone. Jenny, what about me? His voice was low and hoarse, stabbing into my heart like a needle. I stood up, meeting his gaze. You have me. With me, you're just as valid, just as deserving of everyone's love and blessings. Nick, come back to school with me. In my previous life, it was around this time that Nick left school. After that, there was no news about him. But this time, Nick came back. No one at school gossiped about his background anymore. Everyone was intense in their studies. Months flew by in the blink of an eye. On the day the college entrance exams ended, my classmates, who had been as tense as a tightrope, went wild at school like unleashed horses. I stood quietly in the hallway, feeling more relaxed than ever. Jason walked up to me. He was already guaranteed a spot at a university, but he still took the exam. Jenny. He stood beside me, looking up at the clouds. Where do you want to go for college? I had once asked him that same question. I glanced sideways at him. Since I stopped liking him, I realized he was just ordinary. Love really does put on a crazy filter. I'll go to a city that I like, I replied with a smile, but it won't be in B City. He was taken aback. Jenny, he looked down at me. I gave up the guaranteed spot too. I genuinely hadn't expected that. This lifetime, he seemed like a completely different person. If you want to go to S City, I'd be willing to follow you there, he said seriously. I like you, be my girlfriend. I frowned, feeling a bit disgusted, and I wasn't pleased. Nick, who was downstairs, waved at me. My frown disappeared, and I waved back with a smile. As I turned to head downstairs, I told Jason, with your grades, you can still get into B City even without the guaranteed spot. Jason, I don't like you, I said clearly, word for word. I didn't like you before, I don't like you now, and I won't like you in the future. Never will happen. I don't like the version of myself that gave up everything for you. What's so good about Nick? He followed closely, unwilling to give up. He smokes, drinks, fights, and his grades are terrible. He's just an illegitimate child. As soon as he finished, I turned and slapped him. Before, I thought his cheating was a mistake he'd make a decade later, so I shouldn't blame him now. That's why I just wanted to avoid him. I never expected that he was this kind of person. Perhaps I never really knew him. He's better than you in every way, I said, smiling angrily. Jason, what is it you like about me? As far as I remember, from when you first transferred here, I haven't bothered you at all. Look behind you. I gestured with my eyes to the group of girls. Those girls are all over you, yet you don't like them. You choose to like me. Are you a masochist? I asked coldly. Or do you just like conquering women who aren't into you? If I were like those girls, would you still like me? You wouldn't. He might have never heard a girl talk to him like this before. He stood frozen in place. A girl who couldn't stand it approached him, but before she could say anything, Nick grabbed my hand and led me downstairs. Nick and I kept running that day. The wind blew past, lifting my hair. Nick smiled. See? The wind is telling you, you're free. I'm free. Jason didn't come to the graduation party. The girls who liked him looked at me like they wanted to eat me alive. But Nick was sitting next to me, so none of them dared come up. I nibbled on some fruit from the KTV platter, grinning at Nick. You look like my bodyguard now. Gladly, he smirked mischievously, raising an eyebrow. Everyone drank that day. Many classmates were drunk for the first time, completely unconscious. I sent the last girl, who was swearing at me, back home and turned to look at Nick. His ears were tinged with pink. He'd had a good bit to drink. We walked shoulder to shoulder, and this time, the streetlights stretched our shadows long. Although there was still a gap between us, our shadows seemed to hold hands. Jenny. Nick suddenly stopped. I gazed at our shadows and stopped too. I like you, he said, turning to look at me. His eyes, always bright, seemed to pull me in. I lowered my head slightly and tucked my hair behind my ear. I know. I had known for a long time. When he took me to watch his games, when he jumped over a wall to stop those bullies. My background isn't great, my grades are bad, and I get into fights, he repeated Jason's words one by one. But I don't smoke. I slapped my hand over his mouth. His lips were cool, twitching against my palm. It itches. My palms itch. My heart itches too. Your background isn't your fault. I patiently answer one by one, not everyone needs to study well. You swim so well, always getting first place. You can fight but never hit people randomly, and you protect me. You're so good. I blinked and tilted my head to look at him. I like you too. He froze. His eyes got even brighter, like all the stars in the sky fell into them. Really? Really? Then we stopped talking. We walked back to the entrance of the community, both blushing at the gate of the community. As I was about to say goodbye, Nick suddenly asked me, "Want to try some bubble gum?" I was stunned. "It's very sweet," he promised. I nodded dumbly and reached out my hand. But he threw a piece of bubble gum into his own mouth and then blew a bubble. When I didn't know what he was up to, he bent down slightly and touched the bubble on my lips. My mind went blank, and I instinctively licked my lips. With a pop, the bubble burst, and I came back to my senses. "Sweet?" Nick asked me with a smile. In that moment, all the blood rushed to my head, making my entire face burn. I stomped my foot and ran away. Not sweet at all. I lied. Both Nick and I went to S-City. He got in because his swimming results were exceptional, breaking the school's admission rules. In S-City, all the old rumors had disappeared. Nick was posted on the confession wall as soon as he enrolled. Isn't this Nick? I sat in a cafe, sulkily looking at the guy who had just finished training and came to date me. Nick sat down next to me with a grin. I playfully punched his chest and felt it. It was indeed getting more muscular. Every time that happened, it felt like a dream. This was my second time in college, but it seemed like this was how college should be. Endless competitions, endless awards, and a boyfriend who treats me well. Not waiting every day by the boys' dormitory. Time passed by beautifully and warmly. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had gone by. It was again September 8th of my 27th year. I looked at the calendar on the wall, unable to react for a long time. 10 years already. Nick hugged me from behind, also looking at the calendar. Yeah, 10 years ago today, I became your desk mate. I turned around and hugged him with a smile. Get ready to go, we're running late. Today's his last competition before retiring. It's important. He originally didn't want to participate, preferring to stay home with May. Insisted he participate. I didn't want him to have regrets about this. I settled back on the couch after seeing him out the door. Time passed unnoticed. Suddenly, my high school group chat buzzed. Jason's getting married. Someone posted a photo. It was Jason and a woman. Unlike the photo I got 10 years ago, this woman was dressed modestly, and she bore a slight resemblance to me. Cindy messaged me privately, "Jason's really hung up on you." "Stop it, I can't handle that." I replied with a laugh. The high school group chat was still going strong, but my screen just showed Jason's photo with that woman. Everything's different now. Yet somehow, it also feels the same. In a daze, I fell asleep again, struck by a nightmare I hadn't had in a long time. I was still crouched helplessly on the balcony, but this time, I opened Nick's chat window. Just as I was about to type, I stopped. I exited the chat and dialed Nick's number. Nick, who was at the competition, answered the call. He sounded both anxious and gentle. "Don't be scared, I'm here." All my fears vanished instantly. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. Then I heard Nick's voice. "Whatever, I'm retiring anyway. Just say I lack sportsmanship." I struggled to wake up, and the first thing I saw was Nick standing by the floor-to-ceiling window. An unprecedented feeling of safety flooded my heart. My nose tingled, and tears rolled down my cheeks. "Why are you back?" I asked Nick with a raspy voice. He finished his call and turned to look at me. With the light behind him, I couldn't see his expression clearly. All I knew was he felt as warm as the sunlight. He asked with a smile, "You fell asleep while the soup's still on the stove. What would you do without me?" Nick's epilogue. I had just finished a meeting when I saw the news about the fire. "Nick, you have another meeting this afternoon." I loosened my tie and ran outside, with my assistant chasing after me. "Cancel everything. All of it, cancel." I drove through countless red lights to get to the place. There were already a lot of people gathered downstairs, but Jason was nowhere to be seen. His house caught on fire, and he hadn't come back. There. Someone pointed at a balcony in the high-rise building. It was the lady of the house. Jenny. I ignored the police and rushed inside. The elevator was out of service because of the fire. I climbed the stairs floor by floor, my heart sinking with every step. The fire was really bad. In the end, I collapsed outside the door. If I could do it all over again, would definitely not be such a coward and let her go to someone else. Not sure if it's because even fate felt some pity for me, but when I woke up, I was back 10 years ago. "Nick, switch seats and sit next to Jenny." When the teacher said that, I was beyond happy. I started approaching Jenny on purpose. I spread the rumors that she liked me. It didn't matter if she initially only used me to play hard to get with Jason. As long as she stayed by my side, and I could protect her, it was enough. I no longer followed her quietly. I woke up early every morning to circle around to her neighborhood to wait for her, so we could go to school and come back together. Whenever Jason tried to get close to her, would appear right on time. I would make sure to be wherever she appeared. So what if she said she didn't like me? Sooner or later, she would. Everything was getting better. Until one day, my mom, whom I hadn't seen for many years, appeared. I was suddenly reminded of that awful past. I realized the identity I couldn't explain to others. No matter how much I changed, some things were inevitable. That guy named Larry still found me. The thugs he hired were not something I could handle. "You're just a bastard," he said, looking down on me. "Keep your mom away from my family, and don't even think about getting into my house." His words crushed me. This identity made it hard to breathe, and Jenny was even more dazzling than in the previous life. So dazzling that I often asked myself if I was worthy. "Do you think you deserve her?" Jason found me after the college entrance exams and said the exact same words he once did. He had known for a long time that I liked Jenny. This time, I asked him back, "Do you think you deserve her? Do you deserve Jenny's fiery love from the last lifetime?" When I turned to leave, I looked back at him. He was gripping his coffee cup tightly. "You had a chance to have her," I said quietly, "but you didn't cherish it. So don't blame me for taking your place." Because of Jenny, I took a different path this time. I avoided going to Larry's place out of desperation and made my way into the national team step by step. Soon it was time for my retirement. The entertainment industry had already extended an olive branch, and I would be signed into an entertainment company after retiring. I was willing to do anything to give Jenny a good life. She insisted I compete on September 8th. "I like you on the field." I never refused her requests. "Then come watch my game." "Stop it, I have work to do," she said, staying at home. I couldn't feel at ease. I called her twice before the game, but she didn't answer. Endless fear hit me, so I changed clothes and rushed home. When I opened the door, I found her sleeping soundly on the sofa, and the kitchen was simmering my favorite soup. The bubbling sound filled the whole room. I walked into the kitchen and turned off the stove. As the bubbling subsided, my anxiety calmed down. I knelt by the sofa and watched Jenny's serene face, feeling more grateful than ever. Just then, a phone call woke her up. The phone really needs to stay on silent. It's okay, a bit of scandal is good publicity. I'm getting exposure even before entering the entertainment industry. I laughed and hugged her tight, kissing her furrowed brow. "I rushed back just to drink your soup." She was easy to comfort, a little coaxing, and she was fine. The high school group chat was still lively. Suddenly, someone posted a blurry photo. Jenny magnified the photo, pointing at a person behind her and asked me, "Is this you?" It seemed to be from an event in freshman year. "Yes," I said, holding her tight. "I've always been behind you. But since you never looked back, I had to come by your side." She was confused, then asked, "Tell me honestly, when did you start liking me?" "A long, long time ago." "I can't even remember," I replied. "When I was 6, my never-before-seen dad showed up. My mom argued with him inside because he had another family. I felt helpless sitting by the door until 6-year-old Jenny held my hand and said, 'Grown-ups arguing is grown-ups' business. We are kids. We just need to grow up and try to be good adults someday.' Maybe that planted a seed. A seed that slowly sprouted. Then slowly grew. Until it could bloom.